Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here and to deliver the James Meade Lecture. As a student, I have carefully studied many of James Meade's writings. So my task today is to convince you that one can think about some big issues in an analytical way, which is useful and sheds light on very important considerations. So what I will do today is I will discuss a theoretical framework in which we explore a mechanism which relates social identity to the formation of trade policy. And the idea is to develop a framework which can be used more broadly, but I will illustrate it with trade policy. And if you are not entirely versed in formal economics, don't worry, I'll try to explain everything and will minimize the number of equations that I use for this presentation. So what is the motivation for this work? It's the first paper in what we hope will be a sequence in which we discuss social elements in conjunction with political elements in the formation of trade policy. So in particularly, why did we see a sudden shift to economic nationalism? So in many countries, there developed anti-trade sentiments, anti-migration sentiments, and of course anti-EU sentiments. And it appears more broadly that many voters support policies which are against their narrow economic self-interest. So this is what motivated our thinking about the subject. And what we propose in this study is to link these shifts to shifts essentially in social identity. So one view which has been promoted quite a lot by political scientists is that the changing landscape that we observe is due to shifts in identity politics. And I'll explain all of this a little more formally later. And in particularly, they related to the right or to the rise of populism. So the goal of this paper is to introduce what we call identity politics into a political economy framework and analyze the impact it has on tariff formation. And so we are going to focus in this study on the level of protection. This is unlike, for example, studies that we and others did in the past, which try to explain the variation across industries in levels of protection. So here we are aggregating everything and think about high protection, low protection, and we don't worry so much about whether protection takes place in the steel industry or in the soybean industry. And the sort of critical element that we emphasize is that various changes in the economy or the polity, they impact the self-categorization. And these shifts in self-categorization, which I'll again explain a little more later, they trigger changes in policy. And these changes in policy can, at least theoretically, be quite dramatic. So what is social identity? Social identity is the element in the individual self-concept that derives from perceived membership in relevant social groups. This is what social psychologists tell us. A lot of the original work in this area of social psychology was done in the UK by Teifel, and later by a student of his named Turner, who ended up in Australia. So what is a social identity theory? So there is a person derives satisfaction from being affiliated with a group. it sort of provides self-worth, self-appreciation. Now, the groups can be very diverse. This can be tribes, religious groups, socioeconomic groups, and the like. But the key is that I choose to identify with a group that provides me self-esteem or other forms of satisfaction. And the self-image enhanced by the status of the group to which people imagine themselves to belong, this raises their welfare or well-being. But at the same time, there is a source of cognitive dissonance from this identification, and this cognitive dissonance depends on how different the individual is from other group members. So this mismatch in the characteristics of the individual and the group generates this dissonance, and this can be viewed as a cost of identifying with a group. So the self-categorization theory in this social psychology literature tells us that individuals, at least this is how we interpret the literature, so I don't want to make a statement which is too strong, tells us that people choose to identify with a group if the self-esteem that they derive from the identification is larger than the cost of identifying with the group, where the cost comes from this dissonance. And so the critical thing here is that this identification is endogenous. People choose to do it, and they choose to do it given the circumstances. So they may choose under some circumstances to identify with two groups. In another case, other circumstances, they may choose to identify with one group, and so on. The point is that these choices depend on the state of the environment. And there are two critical elements in these choices. First, that no permission is needed. So I can identify with the group even if the group doesn't want me to identify with them. It's my choice, and I can derive self-satisfaction without requiring permission. And the other is, of course, that there's no coercion. So I may be a member of a tribe, but I don't identify with my tribe. Or I can be a member of a political party, but at some point I don't identify with the parties, and so on. So these two elements are sort of critical. So in economics, there were some studies of social identity about 20 years ago, primarily by George Akerlof and Rachel Crenton. However, what they did is very different from what we do today. And their emphasis was on how individual behaviors change when they choose to identify with a particular group. And as I said before, our idea is that these choices have impact on political choices, and therefore eventually, through aggregate behavior of voters, on the policy formation. So the closest to our approach is a paper that was published 10 years ago in the American Political Science Review by Moses Shayo, where he defined a social identity equilibrium as a situation in which individual behaviors are consistent with the social identity that they choose. Social identities are consistent with the social environment, and the social environment is determined by individual behavior. So we will think in similar terms, although the way we model social identity in the environment that we consider is very different. So for our purpose, as I mentioned before, we try to integrate social psychology and political science element into this theory. What we use on the political science side is an approach to electoral competition that was developed long ago, and this approach is known as probabilistic voting. I'll explain it in more detail later. So we do incorporate electoral competition into this framework, and the sort of simple models of electoral competition that were developed at the time, primarily or at least originally by Lindbeck and Weibel, they lead to policy convergence by political actors. And the policy convergence is to states in which some measure of aggregate welfare is maximized. So one important element that is different from what we do and what people did in the past, including ourselves, is that now when we think about individual welfare, we think not only about welfare from material consumption, but also the welfare components that emanate from the self-identification pattern. Now, in order to check robustness of the results, we also use a somewhat different approach, which is known as the median voter outcome, but I will not talk about it today. So the sort of general framework that we end up with is that individuals differ by socioeconomic class and by ethnicity, and they choose whether to identify with their socioeconomic group. They may choose also to identify with their ethnic group or choose not to identify. And what's critical for our analysis, they may choose to identify very broadly with what we call the nation, or they may choose not to identify with the nation. So we will allow these three groups, among which individuals can choose whether they identify with or not. You can easily think about other groups that might be relevant, and there is a sort of issue, what are the salient features of group for this type of analysis? And we feel that this is a minimum specification that helps us to gain some insight into the impact of social identity on trade policy. So the idea here is that changes in the economic environment impact policies. And one result that we find particularly interesting is the following, that when you think about changes in the economic environment, say, it can be, for example, technical change, improvement in productivity, or improvements in the terms of trade of the country at which the country trades with other countries, they will have an impact on the resulting trade policies through the political mechanism. But the impact will be continuous, so to speak, as long as it doesn't induce a shift in social identity. But if it induces a shift in social identity, then there is a big policy change, what we call a discontinuous policy change. So what this means is that shifts in this type of economic features, or it can be some political feature of how individuals evaluate different groups, they can generate very dramatic policy shifts. And this is something that we find quite interesting. So what is the environment in which we analyze these questions? So I will start with a simple environment, and I will tell you later what happens in more complex environment. But I think starting with a simple environment helps understand the mechanism. So we start with a simple environment in which individuals in the country consist of two types. There are some skilled individuals and some unskilled individuals. And one way to think about the skilled individuals is that they are the elite of the country. And then there may be many unskilled individuals. We will later, I will tell you what happens when there are more skill levels. In particularly, we do an analysis with 3 skill levels. And this is sort of useful for looking at the impact of the policies on polarization in the structure of earnings. And we will also allow for ethnic divisions. So the ethnic divisions, generally speaking, we'll talk about minority versus majority, but this can be, for example, black or whites, or immigrants, non-immigrants, and things like this. But we are going to choose a two-way division. The economy that we choose to construct is, for the economist here, is the actual type production structure. But I won't go into the technical details here. So generally speaking, there are going to be two sectors. One sector which produces an import competing product, and the other sector which produces a product that the country exports. Okay? And then there are these two factors of production that these are individuals with different skill levels. So we have individuals with a high skill level and individuals with a low skill level. So these are the indices, H and L. We can normalize the population. The critical thing is the fraction of high-skill individuals in the economy as compared to the fraction of low-skill individuals in the economy. And we are going to assume that the import competing products are intensive in low-skilled labor. This assumption is reasonable for industrialized countries or relatively rich countries like the UK or the US. So the analysis is sort of limited to this type of countries. There are some preferences over consumption goods. And the critical thing is that individuals consume, as I said, imported goods and also some of the goods that the country exports. I won't go into the details of this. And so they derive utility or well-being from this material consumption. So this component is a sort of standard economic component. So to this component, we add these two psychosocial components of utility: pride and self-esteem from group membership, as I explained before. And because we write down a formal model, we have to be more precise what it means. And so the way we are going to think about it is that individuals are more proud to belong to groups that have higher levels of material well-being. But this higher level of material well-being will be translated into pride through some coefficient. And this coefficient can be big or small, depending on the attitude individuals have towards particular groups. And then they have this dissonance cost of group membership, which is determined by how different an individual is from other members of the group. So, for example, in the cognitive science literature, they refer to this as distance in conceptual space. So if, for example, there are two characteristics involved, like socioeconomic status and ethnicity, then you have to construct a distance in this two-dimensional space and calculate the average of the group to which you consider to identify with, and how far your characteristics are from this average. So this is basically the idea. So now about political competition. How does political competition work here? So the basic structure is that there are two political parties, and they are distinguished by political platforms, which we call the ideology of the parties. And what's important is that these features of the parties are unalterable. So a party has a certain ideology, and it cannot change. What can it change? It can change instrumentally what we call sometimes pliable policies. And in the talk today, this pliable policy is going to be the trade policy. So the party has a fixed ideology, but it can change the pliable policy in order to cater to particular voters. Now, why would the party want to do it? It will want to do it only if catering to particular voters raises the vote share that they get in the election. So this is what we build in. So now the critical thing here is that there is some distribution in the voting population over the preferences for the ideological positions of the two parties. So in the context of the USA, some individuals may have a strong preference for Democrats, others may have a strong preference for Republicans, and some may have weak preferences for one party or the other, but there is a whole distribution. And this distribution is sort of fixed. So how do the individuals decide how to vote? So they have a measure which tells them by how much they prefer one party to the other. And then they look at the policy positions of the party, and they decide by how much the policy position of one party gives them welfare, which is higher than the policy position of the other party. And then they add up these preferences for ideology with preferences over policy, and they vote for the party that gives them essentially a better deal. Okay, so this is the idea behind the ideological, about the electoral competition. So there are some results in this literature on voting, and the critical thing for our purpose is the following, that, as I mentioned earlier, this type of electoral competition leads to policy convergence, and this policy, the policy that the parties adopt essentially maximizes aggregate welfare of these voters. But in our context, and this is what's sort of important, aggregate welfare includes not only welfare from material well-being, but also welfare from the identification choices. And what's more important is that the choice of identification depends actually on the trade policy. So I know that if one party offers one particular policy, then I will choose in a way that serves me best a particular identification pattern, and then I will use this identification pattern to evaluate how much I like the policy of this party. And then I'll look at how much I like their ideological position. I'll compare the same calculus with the other party, and I'll vote for the party that gives me a better deal. So this is the sort of idea. So in the simple framework that I'm going to discuss first, there are these three potential identity groups. What we call working class, the elite, and what sometimes may be better described by the nationals. So in the UK, it might be the Brits. In America, are the Americans, yes. So then the issue becomes who's considered to be a true American, say. And I'll come back to this later. At this point, the way we think about it is that if you identify with the working class, it means you identify with the low-skilled individuals. If you identify with the elite, you identify with the high-skilled individuals. And if you identify with the nation, you identify with both groups jointly. Okay? So it's very simple at this stage. So who identifies with the working class? So the less skilled individuals, because they are homogeneous, they are all identical, then if a less skilled individual identifies with the working class, this individual does not bear a dissonance cost because he's exactly like everybody else, so there is no distance between the individual and the group. And therefore, the identification provides satisfaction from the status of the group. Now, the dissonance cost, on the other hand, will be very high for a member of the elite if this member of the elite tries to identify with the working class, because the member of the elite is very different from the group of working class individuals. So members of the elite are not going to identify with the working class. Who will identify with the elite? Again, you can do the same argument about members of the elite. Every member of the elite has an incentive to identify with the elite because they bear no cost, no dissonance cost, but they enjoy the status that they gain from identifying with the elite. On the other hand, if you look at a member of the working class, the low-skilled individuals, they bear a large cost of identifying through the dissonance component, and therefore they choose not to identify with the elite. So we have these two basic identification patterns, that the working class individuals identify with the working class, the elite members identify with the elite members. So this is sort of convenient because we can now focus the analysis of who identifies with the nationals. So if I want to identify with the nationals, namely with the nation, broadly identified, then my status gains are related to the status of the nation. But I also have to bear a dissonance cost. And so if I am a low-skilled individual, the dissonance cost emanates from the fact that the nation includes the elite, and I'm not a member of the elite, I'm a member of the working class. So you have to sort of compute what's this distance for a working class member, and then see whether she finds it useful to identify with the nation or not. And a similar calculus applies to a member of the elite. If a member of the elite identifies with the nation, then she enjoys the high status, possibly, of the nation. But at the same time, she is different than the average member of the nation, because the nation includes the low-skilled individuals. And so she bears a cost of identification, and therefore she has to decide whether it's worthwhile for her to identify with the nation or not identify with the nation. So to identify with the nation, the way we think about it is that this is the sort of broad identification that's available in this framework. So to close the details, we sort of normalize the price of one product. We use Q to denote the price of the import good. This is the price that the country has to pay to the foreign supplier. And then if there is a tariff at the rate T, then the domestic price is what you see in this formula. It's Q times 1 plus T. So this is a sort of standard thing. And then, if you are an economist, you just grind through the details of the model, and I'm not going to do it for you, but you then can derive a measure of material well-being that depends on the wage of the individual, the tariff revenue that the government collects T, and what we call an economic consumer surplus. This is the last component. Okay, so don't make too much of an effort to try to understand what's hiding behind these functions. I'll tell you only one thing which is sort of important, and this is the following. Given the structure of the economy, and in particularly that the import competing good is labor intensive, you can show that the wage of the high-skilled individuals is declining with the price of the imported good. So what this means is that if the foreign price is constant and the government raises the tariff, this will reduce the wage of the elite members. At the same time, it will raise the wage of the working class. And this is sort of very important for the analysis. So the point here is, and this comes out from the economic structure, that what the trade policy does is it shifts relative wages of members of the elite and members of the working class. A higher tariff narrows down the wage gap between these two groups, and a lower tariff widens the wage gap between these two groups. Okay, so then there are all sorts of equations that you don't want to see, so I skip them. And then the result of the analysis is the following. Ask yourself the following question. Suppose that you go through the calculations that we have done, and you can calculate the aggregate well-being, which includes the well-being from identification for the voting population, and call it UPQ. It's a function U of the domestic price of the import competing good and the foreign price of the imported good. And remember, the gap between these two prices is the trade policy. It's the tariff. Okay? So now what you can do is you can ask yourself, how does this measure of welfare vary with the identification regime? So regime 0 is a regime in which essentially everybody identifies with their socioeconomic group, but nobody identifies with the nation. And RH is a regime where everybody identifies with their socioeconomic group, and the elite identifies with the nation. And regime RL is a regime where everybody identifies with their socioeconomic group, and only the working class identifies with the nation. And the last one, RHL, is a regime in which everybody identifies with the nation. The two socioeconomic groups, the elite and the working class, identify with the nation in addition to identifying with their socioeconomic group. Then to sort of understand how one can analyze this sort of issue, here is a sort of simple graph which traces this measure of well-being for different levels of the domestic price of the import competing product, which means different levels of protection. So remember, if the domestic price equals Q, it means that the level of protection is 0. There are no tariffs, no intervention in trade. And then the higher it is, the higher the level of protection. So on the horizontal axis, what we do is we measure the level of protection. So what happens is that if the regime is such that everybody identifies only with their socioeconomic class, but nobody identifies with the nation, then the peak of this curve, R0, is exactly when the domestic price equals Q. Namely, there is no tariff. Now, this is sort of interesting slightly in this context because there are opposing interests between the elite and the working class. Nevertheless, the maximum is attained when there is no protection. Why? The elite wants lower protection and the working class wants higher protection. But in the political competition, they essentially neutralize each other, and the final outcome is no protection. Then the other three curves describe outcomes for the different regimes, and you see each one of them has a peak at a different trade policy. And the highest peak is for the regime in which everybody identifies also with the nation. This is how we drew the curves, yes. So in the paper, we go through the analysis in order to see under what circumstances we'll have this type of ordering as compared to alternatives. So at this point, I'm not going to discuss it, but I just want to illustrate. So now the issue is the following. If in the political competition, the parties choose trade policies, and if this is the true description of this environment, then they will converge on the policy P sub HL, where the peak of peaks is obtained. Okay? So the question then remains is, does this condition satisfy what in economics is called the participation constraint? Namely, that under this policy, everybody wants indeed to identify not only with their socioeconomic group, but also with the nation. And the answer is yes. Okay? So we basically know that this will be the outcome if this is indeed the proper description of the environment. So now some benchmarks and results. So the benchmark that I'm going to use is the following. Suppose that there's no identification whatsoever. So nobody identifies neither with their socioeconomic group nor with the nation. Then, as we know from many years of analysis, starting at least from 1817 with David Ricardo's book, yes, that the best outcome here in aggregate terms is going to be free trade. So this is a sort of benchmark. And the question then is, if in equilibrium there is some identification, how is it going to bias the trade policy? So I already said that if everybody identifies with their socioeconomic group, but nobody identifies with the nation, then trade policy will be free trade as well. And the reason, as I said before, is there are conflicting interests between the elite and the working class, but in the political competition they neutralize each other, and the result is free trade. So the benchmark obtains also when there is identification, but identification does not entail identification with the nation. Namely, it does not entail broad identification, only narrow identification with the socioeconomic groups. Now, when some individuals identify broadly, the interesting thing that emerges then is that there is concern for inequality. In the other case that I mentioned, there is no concern for inequality, essentially. Because on the cost side, the dissonance cost, everybody identifies with a group in which they are identical to other members of the group. So there's no dissonance cost involved. But if you identify with the nation, there's a dissonance cost in this case, because if I am a low-skilled individual, my wage is below the average for the group. And if you are a high-skilled individual, your wage is above the average of the group. So this involves some dissonance cost. So the main result here is that once there is broad identification, this introduces altruism, but not because people are altruistic. They are selfish in a way because they only look at their own well-being, but their own well-being depends on dissonance costs, and therefore depends on wage inequality. And as I mentioned before, what protection does, it reduces the dissonance cost, because higher tariff raises the wage of the low-skilled individual and reduces the wage of the high-skilled individual, and therefore it reduces the dissonance cost. So this already tells you that there might be some incentive to use trade policy when there is broad identification. And there is a result, essentially, which says that this is indeed the case. The result says that if dissonance costs matter, these are these betas, that they are positive. So people place some positive weight on dissonance. Then if any group identifies with the nation, then the political competition will lead to a positive tariff. So there is going to be protection under these circumstances. Now we know that protection is not efficient in the sense that you can reallocate resources and make everybody better off. But the point, of course, is here that you cannot do it. There is a social, economic environment, and there are some instruments available, and with this instrument, this is going to be the outcome. Nobody basically can change. So protection will arise in a sort of natural way. So now you can start asking a set of questions about how sensitive is this level of protection to different features, either of the economy or the polity. And I'm going to, for the sake of time, I will just talk briefly about some of these things. So this you don't want to see either. One result which is sort of robust, and I'm going to illustrate it with the weight or the measure that people place on this dissonant cost. So imagine that one of these groups identifies with the nation. It can be either the highly skilled or the low skilled, and that they place some positive weight on the dissonance cost. So they have a positive beta. And then if a politician convinces them that the dissonance cost is actually bigger than they imagined, which actually you see in many political debates is the case, then this will not affect the policy outcome as long as these shifts do not impact the identification pattern. So the point is that you can have dissonance costs which change, but they have no implications for the rate of protection. Okay, so now some other things. So imagine that the economy goes through a system of technical change. So this is something that we experience almost constantly. There are some improvements in productivity. So let me go to one particular result, and this is that if there is what we call Higgs-neutral technical change, which means that productivity improves, but it improves at the same rate in every sector, then this is going to raise the rate of protection. And again, as long as the pattern of identification is not affected by this rate of technical change, what's going to happen is that there will be a small response in the rate of protection to small increases in productivity. So essentially, the rate of protection responds in the continuous way to the productivity level. Another case which is sort of interesting is what happens when the terms of trade of the economy improve. Why is this interesting? Because import prices have been falling in many industrial countries. So this is reflected formally in this environment by a decline in Q, which is the foreign price of the goods that foreigners export to this economy. Now, how does this impact the rate of protection? So this will bring about a decline in the domestic price. So there will be at least some pass-through, what we call pass-through from foreign prices to domestic prices. But generally speaking, it's not clear what will happen to the rate of protection. And what we do is we provide necessary and sufficient conditions for the rate of protection to increase when import prices fall. Now, why is this interesting? Because one way to think about, for example, what happens in the US is that due to the growth of China, import prices in the US have declined, particularly import prices of Chinese products, and this had some backlash. And so these conditions give you conditions under which this will impact the desire to protect domestic industries. Okay, so let me move quickly to the most interesting result in this simple environment. Okay. So I discussed so far changes in the political or economic conditions that affect the rate of protection as long as the identification pattern does not change. So now I want to turn to situations in which there is a shift in the identification pattern in response to such conditions. And now we are going to call this a populist revolution. I mean, it's not such a great term because many may think that this is not a revolution, yes. But nevertheless, this is what we are going to call it. And our idea of a populist revolution is some trigger that leads to a narrowing down of the identification. So in particularly, it leads some groups to abandon the identification with the nation. And they move to narrow identification. This is actually quite common in many countries. It's definitely the case in the US. I think it's true in the UK. It's true in Hungary. It's true in Turkey. It's true in Israel. And we can bring other examples. So what is populism? There is a wonderful book by Jan Werner Müller, who is a political scientist. And he defines populism as anti-pluralist, elite-critical politics with a moral claim to representation. So the way to think about what we try to do is we take the Müller definition and we say there is some political process that changes individual perceptions about the cost or benefits of identification, and this leads to a narrowing down of their identification. So with the way we think about populism, there is a particular form of identity politics. And as we know, just from reading newspapers, what populist regimes do is they say they classify individuals in the country into us and them, basically, and us and them can be somewhat different in different countries. But what is important is that the them includes the elite. So you exclude the elite from your group of identification. So you may still think that you identify with the nation, but now the nation is defined to exclude the group that you don't like. So it can be the intellectuals, it can be the immigrants, or whatever. So the question that we want to address here is what happens when the political discourse changes these evaluations and it leads to a narrowing down of the identification. So in particular, we are going to look at situations where the working class don't consider the high-skilled individuals as part of the nationals. Okay? But you could also do the analysis otherwise. Now, this could be driven by this political mechanism that I described before, but it can also be triggered by skill bias technical change, for example, or by globalization that leads to falling import prices and the like. Each one of these mechanisms can lead to a narrowing down of identification. So in order to sort of understand this, imagine an initial structure where everybody identifies broadly, namely with the nation. So the relevant regime is this regime that I call regime HL. namely both the elite and the working class identify with the nation. And then there is some change of the type that I described that leads to a new outcome whereby only the elite identifies with the nation and the working class individuals don't. So they sort of exclude the elite from the groups with which they identify. So the point is that this is going to lead to a hike in protection under some conditions. I want to discuss the conditions. But to understand how it works, I repeat the figure with which I started, and think about it, for example, in this way. Suppose that Trump convinces his electorate, which consists mostly of white, middle-class or low-income individuals, that they shouldn't identify with the elite. Why? Because they are different from the others, and the cost of identifying with these other individuals is very high. So what is this going to do? It's going to sort of reduce the aggregate measure of welfare from for the two groups to identify with the nation. So this is this broken curve line. It goes down. Also, the peak moves a little to the right under these circumstances. But the point is the following. If initially the peak of this curve, RHL, is slightly above the peak of the curve RH, which is to the right of it, then a small change in this element, which reduces the benefit of everybody identifying with the nation, is going to turn the peak of the RH curve into the global peak. Okay, this you can see from the figure, the way it's drawn. So then what happens is that the political competition is going to switch from a policy PHL to a policy PH. So there's going to be a big jump in the policy outcome, namely a big hike in the rate of protection. And this is sort of generic in this, environment, that you can have some continuous changes in the economy or the polity, and these continuous changes will initially gradually change the policy, but then once we reach this critical point where there's a shift in identification, there is going to be a big jump in the policy response. So the question is now, when will we get this upward jump? What is required for it? So what we show is that there is a necessary and sufficient condition for this, but basically the condition says the following. If the size of the elite is below a threshold, then we are going to have this big jump to the right. So just to illustrate, there is this last bullet here. This is our empirical contribution in this paper. So if you choose the dissonance cost to be identical in every group, and the benefit from status of the group with which you identify to be 10% of the well-being of the group, then this cutoff is 7.7%. So what it says is, if the size of the elite is less than 7.7% of the population, then we'll observe this rightward shift, discrete rightward shift in policy. So then we go through an additional piece of analysis on these issues, and this is the following. There is a view in social psychology which says that when people identify with a group, then there is some cost for them if there is some other group which has a higher measure of status. So this is sort of envy of other group. And we go through the analysis and we ask the question, if this element of envy vis-a-vis outside groups, so the term that they use is outside versus inside groups, and we go through the analysis and ask the question, does it widen the range in which we can expect this hike in protection, or does it narrowing down? And what we show is, analytically, what we show is that this type of envy widens the range. So instead of 7.7%, it may go up to 10% or 12%, the cutoff point. And this, of course, depends on various features. Okay, so let me move quickly now to the broader framework. So what I've done now is I've discussed this relatively narrow framework with two groups, yes, and no ethnic division. So I want to introduce now ethnic division, because ethnic division actually introduces some additional interesting elements, and I don't have, of course, time to go over them in detail, but I want to report to you some interesting results that emerge when we allow also ethnic division. So let me go straight to the argument. So think about an extension in which we have still these two socioeconomic groups of skilled and unskilled individuals, but now within every group there is an ethnic group that belongs to the majority and an ethnic group which belongs to the minority. So it can be black-whites, or it can be Catholics versus Protestants, or any other type of division that you care to do. And what we do now is we introduce a third type of socioeconomic group. These are individuals who are at the very bottom of the skill distribution. And these individuals are employed mostly in services. This is essentially the structure in many Western economies. So we have the elite, which are the highly skilled. We have a big middle class of individuals, and then we have the very low-skilled individuals who are employed mostly in services. Now, most of these services are not traded internationally, so you have to go through the analysis to account for how prices of these services are determined, given the terms of trade of the country and all that, and I'm not going to go through it. The critical thing is what we have here, and this is that if services satisfy the standard conditions in demand analysis vis-a-vis the import competing groups, then what's going to happen is that if the government raises the price of import competing products by means of a tariff, this is going to depress the wage of the service workers. So this requires an analysis, but this is the outcome of the analysis. Okay? So now remember what's happening. You have immediately a feature of polarization. Why is this? If you reduce the tariff, for example, you engage in trade liberalization, this hits the middle class, but it raises the wages of the elite and of the service workers. So this is a sort of standard feature of polarization in the wage structure. Okay, so now an individual can identify with the socioeconomic group. She can identify with the ethnic group, and she can identify with the nation. Now note that in this case now, identifying with the socioeconomic group is not an obvious choice. In the previous framework, where we didn't have the ethnic division, people always identify with their socioeconomic group, because they were identical to other members of the socioeconomic group, so there was no dissonance cost. And so they did choose to identify. But now, because there is an ethnic division, if I am, say, a low-skilled individual, and there are, my group consists of different ethnicities, I may decide not to identify with this group because I don't like the ethnic composition. So in terms of the socioeconomic composition, we are identical, but we are not identical in terms of the ethnic composition. And so this produces a dissonance cost, and the dissonance cost can be high enough so I choose not to identify. So you see immediately that this introduces a richer structure of possible identification patterns. So I'm not going to go through the details of here, but let's think about an exercise which is somewhat similar to the one we had before. So now we have this ethnic and socioeconomic division. And imagine a situation where the politicians convince people to raise the salience of the cost of identifying, so this dissonance cost. And this particularly affects the identification with the social class and with the broad nation. So the point is now the following. When these costs rise, but they do not change the pattern of identification, so this is similar to an exercise we discussed earlier, then the equilibrium tariff is not affected. But of course, what happens now is that the cost of identification can go up so much that it will shift the pattern of identification. So one possibility is that it will lead to a narrowing down of identification, what we call the populist revolution. Now this can happen within one group or another. And the question is, what is the outcome? So here is the description. So suppose the salience of the cost of identification go up. Okay? Then if the least skilled workers, those who are employed most in services of any ethnicity, doesn't matter whether of the majority or minority, cease to identify with the nation or with their social class, this is going to jump up the rate of protection. So this is a much stronger result than the one we had before, because this is always leading to more protection when the least fortunate members of this society stop identifying with the nation. And even if only some of them do, those that belong to one of the ethnic group but not to the other, it's still going to lead to an upward shift in protection. What happens when the middle class here chooses to give up identification with the nation? This will also lead to an upward jump, but only if the wage of the middle class is above the average of the economy. So this means that in economies in which there are many very, very low-skilled workers who are employed in services, if there are many of them, then the wage of the middle class will be above the average. And this will lead to higher protection, much higher protection, when the middle class stops identifying with the nation. Now, these are sufficient conditions. So it doesn't mean that if the average wage of, say, the middle class is, if the wage of the middle class is below the average, that this will not lead to an upward jump. It may still do. One can write down exactly the necessary and sufficient condition for this. Okay, so concluding remarks. So we think about voter preferences and behavior such that people do not always vote their narrow economic interests. So this is a sort of key component of this theory. And they have concerns for others, but not all others. And many features of the social identity theory is consistent with this type of observations. This doesn't mean that our theory is correct. All it means is that on the face of it, it's sort of consistent with some of these features. Now, if you try to model a social identity in the way we did it, or maybe you choose your own way, you have noted that you have to make many choices, basically. And in a way, we don't feel that all our choices are necessarily the best choices. We feel that they are adequate for trying to understand the mechanism that leads to protection as a result of shifts in social identification. But I think that some of the features can be modified, and this is not going to destroy the sort of key insight that emanate from this theory. And I think we actually do believe that changes in identification for different causes do generate changes in policy preferences, and then through the electoral competition, they impact the policy outcome. We don't have any strong empirical evidence on this yet, but there are many graduate students here. They have to write dissertations. It's a good topic to look at. And as I said at the beginning, one can apply this framework to additional policy measures. There are a couple of sort of larger questions that we don't handle much, but they are so very important. And one is what determines the salient divisions in societies that lead to the division into these groups. We have chosen particular groups, but you can think about alternatives as well. We think that this is a reasonable choice, but there is really no good theory in social psychology, at least based on our reading of the literature, that will inform us how which group becomes salient and under what conditions. And the other thing which is sort of very important is what are the mechanisms that politicians can use in order to impact the cost and benefit of identification. And this is also, to a large extent, an open question. So, for example, we are doing follow-up work in which we expand the electoral competition framework in order to introduce media that are affiliated with one party or the other, and these media try to influence voters. And the way they influence voters is that they essentially provide fake news. And it turns out that once you allow media to intervene in this electoral process with biased news, essentially, to voters who listen to this media, you can get a much richer structure. But this is work in progress. So I'll stop here, and thank you very much for your attention.
Yes, Matt.
Okay. Thank you for the very interesting and thought-provoking lecture. I'd like to ask two questions, if I may. First, in your model, you're using protectionism, I think, as a way to reduce inequality. And there are other policies you might imagine that you could use to introduce reduce inequality as well, and I'm wondering whether that matters. It seems like protectionism is quite a costly way of reducing inequality, at least in terms of national income. And then the second question I have is, although the change in policy you get is discontinuous, I think that the change in welfare is continuous as you move between those things. And then the question is a kind of a philosophical one as to, does that mean we shouldn't be too worried about it, or should we?
Okay, so let me start with the latter question. So aggregate welfare is continuous, as you pointed out. However, individual welfare levels of the groups is highly discontinuous. And so if what matters is the welfare of the low-skilled or high-skilled individuals, they move in the opposite direction, and they move a lot. So there is built-in discontinuity which matters. As far as the first question is concerned, the issue is the following. I mean, this is a standard issue in policy design. If you choose arbitrarily your policy instruments, you can always use non-distorting instruments. And then, obviously, trade policy has no role to play. You'll use a non-distorting instrument to reduce inequality, because this is what generates this dissonance cost. So it's really not useful, I think, to think in these terms that I can choose and pick my instrument. What might be interesting to do is to introduce additional policy instruments which are also distorted. And so if you have a menu of distorting instruments, the question is the impact of trade policy per se, given that you have to adjust other policies as well, will be exactly the same or not. And the answer is that I don't know. And the answer is I hope that it will, but I just don't know. We haven't done it. But the right way to approach it is to, for example, you can introduce an income tax, but introduce a distorting income tax. And then you do the analysis with an income tax and the trade policy. And I believe that you'll get similar results and also some understanding of the income tax structure that emerges in this area. But this, as I said, this is only a guess.
Okay. Thank you very much. So one question that I thought about was that it seemed like the result hinged quite a bit on this idea that an increase in protectionism equalizes wages, so reduces the wages for the high-skilled people working in the exportable sector. But when I think about...
No, they work in both sectors.
They work in both sectors, but it's more intensive, right?
Yeah.
Yep. But when I think about services or non-exportable sectors, I think about lawyers, bankers, doctors, which are quite high-skilled individuals, and exportable. Say the steel worker in Pittsburgh works in a very exportable sector, so it's not so obvious that the exportable sector is high-skill intensive and the import competitive is. But it seemed like the results hinges very much on that assumption.
So in Western countries, the exportable is skill intensive. That's the rule. I mean, this is just an empirical fact. Now you can introduce the use of skilled workers in services as well. The question then will be, how intensive is their use as compared to their use in the exportable sector, and how intensive is the use of the least skill in services. So again, knowing what we know from an analysis of international trade, other models of international trade, my guess is that if we do it, and the use of skilled workers in services is relatively small, like lawyers and accountants, yes, it's not going to change this result. It's a matter of the ranking of these sectors by relative intensity. But we have chosen this sort of extreme formulation because it brings it out in the sharpest possible way. But I don't think this is going to really change an awful lot.
nature, we kind of